Hello, Pick It Onion Knight here, and I'm finally getting around to doing the Collect Emulator Void series for Generation 6. And I'm going to start with the Dreamcast. Now, as you'll know, this video's been held up. And the reason it's been held up is because the story is very, very long and very, very complicated, and I've been trying to cut it down. Now, I had this whole thing written up about what was going on at Sega at the time, what was going on at other companies at the time, the reason for the Dreamcast's existence, the people that were involved, the companies that were involved, so Sega and Microsoft primarily, and a story about a man named... Now, if you don't know who that is, I'll put a photograph up here. Yeah, so there was a lot of stuff about this guy. That's odd, isn't it? Hang on. Right, well, I've just been and checked, and according to YouTube guidelines, the phrase makes your content non-advertiser friendly. So what I have to do is replace the name with the name Darth Vader. So yeah, some of the stuff that I was going to do was around this guy, Darth Vader, and what potentially he sold Sega down the river for his own gain. But I decided, do you know what? None of that's important. None of it's really historically provable anyway. A lot of it is rumour and, you know, to do with stuff that was going on in various companies at the time. You know, a lot of it is hearsay and backroom deals that nobody will ever be able to prove one way or the other. And at the end of the day, I decided that's probably not what's important to somebody that wants to collect for these systems now. They don't really care. They want to play some games and have a half-decent collection and know what's available. And very few people care what was going on behind the scenes. If the console's good, they want it. If it's not, they don't. So I decided to just ignore all that. So, here is my very, very much shortened overview of the Dreamcast. Basically, I am going to talk about some things that were going on, but anything that I would consider unprovable or speculation or rumour or something like that probably isn't going to be in here, unless I decide it's warranted. And there you go. So, basically, to give it a very much a simplified overview, the Dreamcast came about because the Saturn basically died. Now, there are reasons behind that, there are provable reasons behind that, and there are other things that were going on. Various quotes from various people, one of whom being Darth Vader. But basically it came down to the fact that the Saturn hardware was too complicated. It could do lots of things very, very well, but it was too complicated. It was simply too complicated, and third-party developers basically jumped ship at that point. They weren't interested. You know, they were gone. They said, well, no, we're not going to support the Saturn, basically. It's not going to happen, which is a shame, but that's how it works. So the Dreamcast was built from off-the-shelf components, which would have made it at the time very expensive to do, because obviously if you're developing your own in-house stuff, your own in-house components and things like that, then you don't have to pay quite so much for them. You have to pay more in R&D, but the actual end cost of building the thing is reduced. Because the Dreamcast was built of off-the-shelf components, then obviously they all had to be sourced. And because Sega realised that they would have to, you know, they would really have to show off how much of a powerhouse this new console was, the off-the-shelf components had to be the top spec, basically. They had to be top spec stuff that would last for the next, you know, presumably they were thinking 5-10 years' time till they could come out with another console. At least that was the thinking at the time. So the Dreamcast, for what it actually does, could be argued is a little bit overpowered. Especially when you consider that it came out and basically started Generation 6. It was the first one to market, and it basically had the market to itself for about a year. Although, as I'll go through later on, it kind of didn't. Because people already knew what was going to happen in the future and were holding out for that. So, let's go into the models that you might find. Some you will obviously have to find on eBay, some you might be able to find at your local boot sale. So, you've got the Japanese models. Oh, actually, I'll start simple. I will start very, very simple with the European one. And that is basically a white Dreamcast with a blue logo. There's only one. There's no reissue, there's no special model, that's it. You buy a Dreamcast in Europe, that's what you get. So there's just that one. The US got that one with an orange logo, which is the original logo for the Dreamcast, and they got the Sega Sports version, which is exactly the same, only black. Interestingly enough, the European one came with a 33.6K modem, and the US one came with a 56K modem. That's basically the only physical difference between the consoles, apart from the fact one's got a blue logo, one's got an orange. And then we get into the Japanese one. There's the standard model with the orange with a 33.6K modem. There's the standard model with a 56K modem. There's a Toyota edition. There's a Seaman edition. Seaman being a game, not the thing that... There's a Hello Kitty edition. There is a Resident Evil edition. And there's a few more other than that. There's different colours and things like that. Most of them were mail order only, so they weren't in the shops. You had to order them from Sega themselves. And then there's this weird thing with a Dreamcast in a television called the Divers 2000 edition, which is a Japanese thing. And, you know, I think there's only like 2,000 of these. So that's supposedly the rarest model. Nobody has one of them. Right, now I'm going to start this before I go into anything else. I'm just going to say that from my point of view, by this point in my life, by the time the Dreamcast came out, now I wasn't really aware of the Dreamcast until probably the year 2000. Supposedly it came out in '99. I had no idea. Because I was sort of on to other things at the time. You know, I was looking at making a life for myself, and I was taking very little interest in games at the time. But I did have a PlayStation. That was my gaming machine. In 1999, 2000, I had a PlayStation, and basically I was just waiting for the PlayStation 2. Everyone knew it was coming, and that was it. You know, and also at the time, I just spent 150 quid on a DVD player, so quite a lot of my money at the time, my disposable money that is, was going on buying DVDs. I think like most people in 99, 2000, they were slowly replacing their VHS movies that they loved with the DVD versions of those movies. Which were probably running about 12 to 15 quid a time. I mean, they weren't cheap, DVDs, when they first came about. The players weren't cheap and the discs weren't cheap. So this was obviously a problem for the gamers market because they were effectively going after the same people. So there wasn't really the marketing push, certainly in Britain, for the Dreamcast. I think there was in the States. I think that was a thing they had there, that the Dreamcast was coming out. But I don't remember there being much of a marketing push in Britain for the Dreamcast. I mean, we were sort of aware of it, but it wasn't until you walked into sort of Dixon's or Woolworths or something like that, and they actually had one on display for you to play with, that, you know, you didn't really think about it. So that's basically a little bit of my personal history at the time and why I wasn't really interested in the Dreamcast. It was kind of it was like this weird thing, and it was a Sega console, And it was white as well, rather than black. It didn't really look like a Sega console at the time. Every Sega console was sort of jet black. This thing came out, and it's a white-looking thing with coloured buttons, and you're sort of going, well, that doesn't really look like a Sega console to me. But anyway, the only time I really became aware of it was on Sunday mornings at local boot sales. And it wasn't the consoles you would see. You would never see the console. You would always see the games. But they weren't proper games. They were all burned games. And I'll give you an example. I used to go to a boot sale near me that was on every Sunday. I don't think they run it anymore. But what used to happen was, if you turned up at 10 to 12... and the inspector was still hanging around, because they used to have sort of boot sale inspectors that would go around and make sure everything was above board. And then he'd disappear at 12 o'clock. So by 10 past 12, you'd suddenly find all these tables that had nothing on them, and suddenly whipped out all these boxes of hooky DVDs and hooky games, and all the dodgy stuff came out sort of 10 past 12 once the boot sale inspector had gone. And that was the only time I really encountered Dreamcast stuff, was all these hooky games. And I thought, well, that's odd, because you didn't really see that for other consoles. You didn't see it for PlayStation, for instance, because although lots of people did have mod chips in their PlayStations for playing burned games, they were a pain to fit. And I know, because I did a few of them at the time, and they weren't 100% compatible. So there was still stuff that, even if you had a mod chip fitted, still wouldn't play if you had like a CD burned copy of it. Whereas in the Dreamcast, all you had to do was buy this one disc, and you could just play everything. You could play whatever you wanted. You could play burn games, you could play, presumably homebrew games if they existed at the time. And you just used to go around boot sales and see boxes and boxes of all these pirated discs. And that was a problem. So that's sort of my personal history with it. And I didn't really think about the Dreamcast again until quite recently. In fact, well, not as recently as doing this, but in the last few years, I've thought, should I, shouldn't I? Maybe I will, maybe I won't. I decided not to, because I can't really have another console in my life. I've got too many already. There's too many things I collect for, and there you go. Right, so that's my personal experience with this console. At the time, it was relevant. And in fact, even years later, when you did used to see the odd console for sale, at boot sales and things like that, it would be, the console, a controller, maybe a VMU, maybe an extra controller, and then just a suitcase of games on CDR to go with it, because there are so many people, one or two I know personally, that literally bought this console, maybe bought one or two games, and then realised, why am I buying these games? I can just rip them off, or copy them off somebody else, or rent them from somewhere and copy them then. It wasn't difficult. And by 2000, 2001, everyone had a CD burner. It was not difficult to do. The other thing that shot this console in the foot was lack of DVD support. Now, in the previous generation, that wasn't an issue, because DVDs didn't really take off. There were things called VCDs, which were supported by the Saturn and the PlayStation, provided you had additional hardware to do it. They were supported. DVDs weren't supported by this console, and that was a mistake. Sure, it kept the price of the console down, but when you've already stuck basically a hardware powerhouse for the time under the bonnet, it's a bit silly to not stick a DVD laser on top. I know why they did it, but it was purely a cost issue. They probably could have done it, chose not to, and I think that was a problem. And especially when I come to do the PlayStation 2 video in this generation, you'll realise how much having a DVD player gave the PlayStation 2 a massive advantage. That had the Dreamcast had in 1999, probably, I'm not saying it would have edged it above the competition, but it would have probably done a lot better than it did. Because then it could have gone for two markets. The DVD market was massive, sort of 99 through to about 2006. The DVD market was massive, and I think if this thing had been released DVD compatible out of the box, it would have done so much better. But that's my opinion. So, I've gone through the makes of consoles. What about the other stuff that you can buy? Well, we have to talk about the controller. Now, I have no love for this controller. I mean, it's certainly comfortable. It's a comfortable to hold controller, but once you've got the rumble pack in it, once you've got the VMU in it, it starts to get not heavy exactly, but you know you're holding it. You're very aware. When you've got all the gubbins in it, you're very aware of the fact that you're holding a controller for hours and hours on end. If you see what I mean, it's not overly heavy, but it's not exactly, you know, petite and comfortable for very long periods of time. Also, the irritating thing is the wire comes out the bottom. And it's just odd. I mean, obviously, I know why the wire's got to come out the bottom. It's got to come out the bottom to accommodate all the hardware in the top. But was there no way that could have been done the other way around? I mean, obviously, that wouldn't help with the long-term weight of the thing. But a wire coming out of the bottom, it just doesn't seem right. It just, I mean, we're used to it now because Dreamcasts have been around for a long time. But when the thing came out, it was just odd looking. It was an odd looking controller. It just didn't seem to fit. Especially if you look at it in sort of profile with that big pregnant lump coming out the top of the controller. It's like where the stuff goes. It's it just does look a bit odd. But it plays perfectly fine. The sticks on it are perfectly fine. The D-pad could probably do with being a little bit more sensitive than it is, but, it all works perfectly fine. And they're cheap. Dreamcast controllers, even on eBay, tend to go for pretty cheap. So you can quite easily find 4 of these things for no real issue. I don't know how many games on the Dreamcast actually support 4 players, but you'll be able to find controllers absolutely no problem. And again, they come in a range of different colours and things like that. Now, I've only ever seen the white ones, but I'm given to understand that they come in about 10 different colours. So, you could sort of N64 it if you wanted to and have a different colour for each person, whatever floats your boat. So like I mentioned, there's a rumble pack you can get to go in there, again copying an idea from the N64. And these aren't too hard to find, but they're much rarer than the next thing, which is the VMU. And the reason these aren't rare is because basically if you owned a Dreamcast, you had to have at least one VMU. You could do without the rumble pack, but you needed a VMU, otherwise you couldn't save games. But the interesting thing about the VMU, well, the interesting thing and its major drawback, in fact, is that it's a memory card, but also it's got little buttons on it and a little D-pad of its own. And some developers use this to great effect, so they would program in mini-games that could be played on the VMU. Maybe you could unlock extra stuff for your games by playing them. And then some just didn't bother. They'd maybe put a logo or something in there that doesn't mean very much. The drawback with this is, if you choose to go down that route, the VMU is powered by a separate battery, which is like a sort of watch battery. And if you choose to actually use the VMU as a gaming device, that watch battery doesn't last very long. It'll probably last you, if you were to play, say, an hour a day, it would probably last you about a week, and then you'd have to change the battery. So that is one major drawback for a feature that was clearly meant to be used by all the developers that not many bothered to take advantage of. So that's an issue. But because it doesn't have like an internal battery, because it doesn't have anything that can really go wrong with it, quite often you find VMUs and maybe they're not working or whatever, but that probably just means the battery needs changed. So if you find one, provided there's no corrosion and the battery hasn't been left in there for the last 15, 20 years, you should be okay. But that is another issue, is corrosion. If you're buying a VMU off somebody, get them to unscrew the little battery thing and let you look, because if it's corroded, you won't be able to use it. So that's an issue with that. There's also the usual Sega affair of an arcade stick. Again, doesn't really look like a Sega arcade stick, but it is an arcade stick nonetheless. It's an official thing. There's also a mouse. There's also a keyboard, because this is an internet-enabled console. Now, apparently this was a big deal in the US, so much so that they actually have a broadband modem for it, which supposedly came out here as well, but I've never actually seen one. So I am told that there is a broadband adapter that was released for the European Dreamcast, but I have never personally seen one. But like I say, this is not something... Dreamcast stuff you don't see every day. It's not like the Sega Saturn steering wheel that you will see every boot sale from now until the end of time. It was a very niche console when it came out, and it's still a reasonably niche item. So the accessories and things you don't often see. What else? There's a gun. There's a light gun that doesn't have a silly name, as far as I know. It's just called the Dreamcast Gun. And this was available with... you could either buy it separately, or you could buy it bundled with a game that was House of the Dead. Or House of the Dead 2. Nobody seems too sure. A lot of... Because in researching it, I knew that you could buy the gun separately. I did not know that it actually came bundled with anything. And some places say House of the Dead, some places say House of the Dead 2. That might be a regional thing. I don't know. But anyway, one of the Houses of the Deads came with a gun. There's a fishing rod that comes with Sega Bass Fishing, although again you could buy this separately. I don't know how many games supported it, but this is a very common controller. I've seen these more than once, so I'm guessing I've probably seen them more than the guns, if I'm honest. So I'm guessing the fishing rod was quite popular. Now, there's a microphone as well, which plugs into a slot on the controller instead of the rumble thing. Now, this was available separately in Europe, and in the US it came bundled with a game called Seaman. Now, again, this is another thing I've never actually seen. I'm aware of this game exists. I'm aware that it's narrated by Leonard Nimoy, and I'm aware of the premise of the game. You basically bring up this Seaman fella to, through evolution and learning and things like that. I've never seen a copy of this game in Europe. I have no clue if it exists in Europe. Supposedly it was released, but it was some sort of limited release in certain countries, and I have never seen one in my entire life. So this might be a US exclusive. Now, why do I keep mentioning all these regional exclusive? Well, it goes back to this same thing as to why the Dreamcast was so good if you're a video game pirate. Because you can play literally anything. So provided you have the tools, and I'm not going to tell you what software you need to do this. You can go and look it up yourself online. But provided you have the right disc that enables you to play pirate games, obviously that also enables you to play retail games. Regional games. So that means that even if you have a PAL, even if you have a European Dreamcast, there's nothing to stop you importing stuff from the US or Japan, provided you have this disc that unlocks the console to allow you to play anything you want. Now, the funny thing is, this actually worked in reverse for certain titles. Now, towards the end of the Dreamcast life, and again, I'm not going to go into, deals that the Evil Empire and Darth Vader did behind the scenes, but towards the end of the Dreamcast life, a lot of stuff, certainly in North America, stopped being produced for the Dreamcast, but was still made for other territories. The notable example, of course, being Shenmue 2, which is a lot of people's go-to game, or certainly Shenmue's a lot of people's go-to game for the Dreamcast. Shenmue 2 as well. It came out in Japan for the Dreamcast. It came out in Europe for the Dreamcast. It did not come out in North America for the Dreamcast. It came out in North America for the Xbox. So going back to the thing that I wasn't going to mention at the beginning of the video. But what a lot of shops did in the US, and perhaps not the big ones like EB and GameStop, because maybe they weren't allowed to do this, but certainly there are tales of a lot of independent shops that imported Shenmue 2 to the US. And also, when you bought a copy of Shenmue 2, there was like a $10 extra on top of what you'd already paid to buy it, and they would give you basically the piracy disc that would let you play it. So there are lots and lots of people in the US that even if they didn't want to, even if they weren't interested in pirating the console, because they went to their local game shop and bought an imported copy of Shenmue 2, also ended up having to buy the disc that would let them play Shenmue 2, but would also then give them the facility to let them pirate their own games after that. Even if that wasn't their intention, there are plenty of people that did that and now had the ability to pirate the games for the console, which arguably just made the thing worse. So yeah, I'm not going to go massively into the list of games. Like I say, a lot of them ended up being ported to other places because commercially the Dreamcast was unsuccessful. It did a little bit better in North America than it did in the rest of the world. In Japan, it took quite a while for it to actually catch on because the Saturn was a monumental success story in Japan. And I think a lot of people just decided that, I bought, a lot of Japanese people perhaps went, I've got a Saturn, that's my Sega console. I've now bought a PlayStation since then, and that's my other console. I'm not going to go and buy a Dreamcast just because. Which is a shame, because the thing is, right, so where does that leave us today? To summarise this whole thing up, do I avoid? No, obviously not. Do you emulate? Well, yes, if you can. Do you collect? Well, if you have room for another console in your life, you definitely do. And here's why. Now, I don't know how much these things cost in the US or in Japan or anywhere else where this video is being watched. But in the UK, there's no real market for them at the moment. So as of November 2017, there's no real market for this console. People aren't buying it. So let's say you gave yourself a starting budget of £100. I reckon if you shop around and you did a few deals, I reckon you could probably get a box Dreamcast with a couple of controllers, a couple of VMUs, and maybe half a dozen games for £100. Now that's quite a good starting point for your collection. Now, perhaps those games aren't going to be the sort of AAA titles that everyone wants on the Dreamcast. You know, if you spend £100 and you're going to get half a dozen games, a box console, and a couple of controllers, you're probably not going to have Shenmue 2. But you might have, I don't know, you might have the Sonic game that's on there, whose name escapes me at the moment. You know, what else might you have? You probably have Soul Calibur. You know, you'd be amazed what you can get. And this is the other thing: the games, the vast majority of the games are still reasonably priced. Because it's not a skewed market like it maybe is for other systems, you know, notably the Super Nintendo or something like that. You know, they're not basically slapping a huge price sticker on something like, you know, there's no Dreamcast equivalent of Beethoven's Second or something like that, or Home Alone, that's got a stupidly ridiculous price tag on it because it happens to have the box and manual. Dreamcast games, if they're expensive, that very, very much does reflect either the demand for them. So, like I say, something like Shenmue 2 are on the expensive end of things because there's a demand for them. Or it's because they're extremely rare. So if you see a Dreamcast game and it's up around £30-40, that's either because people want it, so it has to be a bit more expensive, otherwise it wouldn't be on the shelf, or it's rare, so therefore there aren't many of them about, so it commands a higher price. But the vast majority of Dreamcast games, I reckon you could probably buy your first 100 games of a collection for around about £300-400, which would work out at about £3 to £4 a game. You know, see, maths, which isn't bad considering the generation that we're in. Where, bearing in mind, at the moment you have stuff like, you know, there are certain PlayStation 2 games that are going for stupid money because they're considered rare and they're, you know, mostly not worth collecting. The Dreamcast doesn't really have that. It doesn't seem to have the same. It doesn't seem to have the same retro clout about it, where people are slapping silly price stickers on something and calling it rare when it's not and it doesn't deserve the high price. So, I would advise if you have room for another console in your collection that you don't already have, the Dreamcast is a pretty good bet. Also, there's VGA support. Now, that's not going to mean much to most people because they're going to go, well, VGA, isn't that the connector that computers used to use before they had other things like DisplayPort and HDMI? Well, yes, it is. But what it means is that the Dreamcast will actually clean up better on your new television than most other systems of this generation will. Alright, you need to buy extra hardware in order to do that, but it's very, very easily done, and yeah, the Dreamcast will clean up probably, if I was to take the Xbox out of the equation on the Generation 6, I would say the Dreamcast probably is just as good as that, if it's not going to be better than that. I'm talking rubbish. But if you take the four main consoles in this generation, the Dreamcast easily is second best on a modern television, provided you have the VGA set up to get the best picture out of it. Now, obviously, guns still won't work. Goodness me, it's windy out there. Obviously, guns still won't work. But like I say, it is absolutely fine. But yeah, to sum it up, collect if you can. The systems are cheap. The accessories, for the most part, are cheap. You might struggle to find the keyboard, the mouse and the gun. Possibly the microphone as well. But a system, a few controllers, a couple of VMUs, a rumble pack or two, and, you know, half a dozen 10 games is not going to set you back an awful lot of money at the moment, provided you're not too fussy about what games you get. Like I say, if you have a wish list set up for Dreamcast, be prepared that most of the things on your wish list are going to be exactly the same games that everyone else has on their Dreamcast wish list, and you might have to spend some money. But for the vast majority of stuff, if you wanted to get a full collection of games for a console very quickly, this is a good one to do, because the vast majority of the games are so cheap. You know, some of them stupidly cheap. I mean, I have seen job lots of games go on eBay and there's like 20, 30 games in there and the thing's gone for 20, 30 quid. All right, delivery on top. So you're talking maybe another tenner. So you're talking like 40 quid for 30 games in some cases. So yeah, that's it. That's me summed up the Dreamcast. Now, like I say, this video has been very much cut down from what I originally perceived that it should be. And also, I think a lot of times I've sort of rambled myself into circles when I've done some of these videos and started ending up confusing myself. Even though I've got it all written down, you know, it's still easy to get confused, because basically what I've got written down is loads of bullet points. But I think actually to take these things out of their historical context and try and sort of place them in this context where people who just want to collect for them now and aren't really interested in the history might be a better way to do these. Because obviously as we get towards more recent history, the story gets less and less interesting because there's far more information about. And certainly once we get into stuff like the PS2 and the Xbox, there is so much information about why those consoles exist, who was involved, what deals were done, that sort of, you know, and things like that. That there's not very much I can add. It's kind of pointless trying. So this is probably going to be the format that most of these are going to follow. And I know there's not many left to do, to be fair, so it might be a bit late to the party. But still, this is the kind of format I'm going for, where I talk less about the history of what was going on in their various companies, and I just try and focus a little bit more on what's relevant to somebody now. And hopefully, with that being my aim, hopefully I've done that. Now, as usual, to end the video, there's a comment section at the bottom. Now, I have had a lot of bad luck with these comments. Some stuff, right? So understand, before you write your horrible trolly comment, do understand that some stuff has been left out, either because it's boring or I felt it wasn't relevant. So, you know, there's obviously going to be one or two accessories. Like, I haven't spoken about the Samba de Amigo maracas and you know, foot pad thing, for the simple reason that I don't think anyone cares. I'm not going to bang on about an accessory that works with one game, you know, and when you buy the game, it came with it. So, you know, so there's obviously going to be stuff that has been omitted from the video, although ironically not now, because I've just added it in at the end, because I just consider it irrelevant. So do bear that in mind before you put your comment. I don't want 100 comments saying, you forgot about the Samba de Amigo, because for some reason people love that game. I don't understand it. And also bear in mind that before you put your comments that I may have got something wrong, and by all means do call me on it, but there's no need to be, there's no need to be so there's no need to be so condescending about it when you do it. You can just say, oh, you missed this bit. Because quite frankly, the only people that's going to read them comments are going to be other people watching this video. And what you've done there is you haven't really called me out for being wrong. You've informed somebody else. So why not look at it that way and just be a bit nicer about it? And I just want to add at the end, an opinion is an opinion is an opinion. If yours is different, there's no need to be trolly in the comments, because when I see it, if I think you're just being nasty for nasty's sake, I will just delete your comment. A poof, there it's gone. And nobody will see your half-baked trolly opinion on what you think I should have talked about. So, aside from the comment section, you can find me on Twitter. No, because it's the end of the video, there's some other stuff popped up here at the side that you may like that I've done recently. There's also a subscribe button here, so I hope you click on that. And I will see you in another video. The next one of these is going to be on the GameCube, so stay tuned for that.